if you're an MMTer, you understand that macroeconomics is about the federal government and the central bank and, these large systems and the way they organize the world. And then microeconomics is about the local, the individual, and that kind of thing. But then, there's at least another term that we could introduce, which would be the meso level, mesoeconomics, in between, right? That's not quite federal, but is also not just really small micro local actors. And honestly, our economies are in large part driven in a big way by these meso level major institutions and actors. I mean, Amazon would be one of them, right? Walmart would be another one of them. But also, we don't often think of it this way, but also public university systems, and of course also private ones as well.
If we think about credit as a language that perhaps banks can speak because they are licensed to, you can start to sort of think with and understand how knowing the language of credit, right? Like, for example, knowing the English language allows all of us to speak, and we can say the words that signify the different meanings. And endogenous money, we can think about it in the way of you are licensed to speak credit into the world. And that is ultimately a question of what sort of institutions we want to allow to speak.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guests this week, the hosts of Money on the Left podcast, Maxx Seijo and Scott Ferguson. And we're going to be talking to them in a moment about the Uni Currency Project, which can be seen as a companion of two other currencies previously launched by US universities, Denison University's Denison Volunteer Dollar and University Missouri Kansas City's Buckaroo. In the case of the Denison Volunteer Dollar, students get paid $10 per hour to do volunteer work for various non-profit organizations in the local community. The dollars themselves are beautifully designed pieces of paper, but even so, they are still just pieces of paper, and that presents the university with a problem. I actually looked up things to do in Granville, Ohio, where Denison University is located, and the top recommendation was a place called Licking Park, which sounds wonderful to me. Why would any college-age person in a town with a licking park want to take time out of their busy day studying and licking to do extra work for pieces of paper? And the answer is, just like our national currencies, it's what you can buy with those pieces of paper, or rather, what you need to buy with them. When it comes to your national currency, there's one compulsory piece of spending that we all have to do, and that is we all have to pay our taxes, and only our national currency is acceptable for payment of taxes, which creates a permanent demand for the currency, and that's why here in the UK, everything is for sale in pounds and not pebbles or seashells. In the case of the Denison Volunteer Dollar, the students have to pay $50 per semester in taxes, and 5% of a student's total grade is assigned to this tax. So there's a real consequence for non-payment of taxes, just like there is with your national sovereign currency. If you're new to thinking about money in this way, consider where the money in your pocket must have originated from. Here in the UK, our money's got a picture of the Queen on it, it's signed by the chief cashier of the Bank of England, and you go to jail if you try to copy it. So if it's not counterfeit, the money you use comes from the government. And if the government is the issuer of the currency, it follows that the government has to spend it first in order for there to be any pounds out there for people to pay their UK taxes with. And this is why you'll hear MMT advocates say that taxes don't fund spending, but rather government spending supplies the private sector with the currency it needs to pay its taxes back to government. In our episode 20, MMT founder Warren Mosler, one of the architects of the UMKC Buckaroo, mentions that he felt it was important to the students' learning that the Buckaroo be freely transferable, so a student could earn them from somebody who already had them or just buy them with US dollars. And in the decade or so after its launch, the value of the Buckaroo increased in US dollar terms from $5 to $15 apiece. Were these currencies designed as an investment vehicle? No, they were designed as a tool to provision the public purpose, to provision local communities with student labour. And this is what MMT argues is the origin story of our national fiat currencies, and that they should be viewed as a policy tool to move resources from private sector use into public sector use. To illustrate why governments do this, here's a characteristically crisp passage from the late David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Quote, "Let us take a hypothetical example. Say a king wishes to support a standing army of 50,000 men. Under ancient or medieval conditions, feeding such a force was an enormous problem. Unless they were on the march, one would need to employ almost as many men and animals just to locate, acquire, and transport the necessary provisions. On the other hand, if one simply hands out coins to the soldiers and then demands that every family in the kingdom was obliged to pay one of those coins back to you, one would, in one blow, turn one's entire national economy into a vast machine for the provisioning of soldiers. Since now every family, in order to get their hands on the coins, must find some way to contribute to the general effort to provide soldiers with things they want. Markets are brought into existence as a side effect." End quote. Also, the Buckaroo growing stronger against the dollar underlines which entity is in control of the value of the currency in real terms. The Buckaroo can rise or fall against the dollar, but it's internally stable because it's fixed by the issuer at the level of 1 per hour of student labour. If the university decided one day to pay 2 per hour, it would instantly make the currency half as valuable, and its value in US dollars would likely eventually change to reflect that. And this is analogous to our national currencies. We have one supplier, a monopolist, in our case a government, and a monopolist sets the exchange value of the thing it issues by saying what you have to do to get it. As Warren Mosler puts it, the price level is necessarily a function of prices paid by government when it spends or collateral demanded when it lends. Also, and ultimately for me, these currency projects explain the source of unemployment, which is the issuer of the currency itself. The need to pay taxes in buckaroos creates people looking for work that pays in buckaroos, otherwise known as unemployment. And the university creates that unemployment so it can spend buckaroos into existence to get work done. Applying this to our national currencies then begs the question, why would we create a money system to provision the public purpose and then not run it optimally? For a currency issuing government, unemployment is the evidence that the government hasn't maintained enough spending power in the economy to give a job to everybody that wants one. And this cuts people off from the thing they need to survive in a monetary economy. I can vaguely recall an episode of Star Trek where Captain Kirk and his crew encounter two advanced civilizations at war, but instead of fighting the war, both sides crunch the numbers and figure out what the mortality rates would be if they were to actually fight the war conventionally. And then instead of fighting, they agree to have that number of their own people sacrifice themselves by walking into disintegration chambers. And even though this arrangement was less messy than conventional war, the crew of the Enterprise were understandably horrified by the waste of life, and they spent the rest of the episode trying to get these warring factions to see this. And speaking on a personal level, this is kind of what it feels like to comprehend why we have a money system and then watch as we willfully destroy lives because of some numbers on a spreadsheet at a central bank. And I'm sure this is what motivates a lot of us as we try to raise consciousness and build a movement for more rational policies. So, In the show notes, I've linked to where you can get in touch with Scott and Max and read the paper they co-authored with their colleagues William Sass and Benjamin Wilson. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Your support really helps keep the show going, and it keeps us going, and we really appreciate it. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 77 British pence at the time of recording, and no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. As ever, thanks for the time you take out of your busy day working and maybe licking to understand and spread the word about MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And it's our great pleasure to welcome not one but two very learned people who are, among many other things, the hosts of the awesome Money on the Left podcast. It's Maxx Seijo and Scott Ferguson. Welcome to the MMT podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Our absolute pleasure. So let's do the origin stories first. So Scott, Patricia interviewed you for our episode 17, which was a great episode, which I just revisited, and we'll link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, all about Marx and MMT.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a great unpacking of the climate at the time as well, which kind of hasn't changed. So
well, yeah, it has, and it hasn't.
Yeah, a lot of some people have done a bit of doubling down, haven't they? But just to recap, as a PhD in rhetoric and film studies, what got you pointed in the direction of understanding modern money? Because I believe it's got something to do with late 19th and early 20th century Marxism. And there's a tie in there between that and the title of Max's other podcast. But you tell it your way. I'll get out of the way.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, the MMT origin story is, I love them. I love hearing everybody tell me theirs. And I could probably tell mine in different ways, but I was pretty primed, I think, for MMT in certain ways because I was a critical student of aesthetics and aesthetic theory in the tradition that's known as critical theory, that comes out of a school that's loosely called the Frankfurt School. And it was a bunch of German critical philosophers who were Marxists, who precisely rejected the so-called vulgar Marxist binary opposition between the base, the immediate mode of production and productive capacity of society, and what they called the superstructure, right? Everything else, the state, law, culture, novels, paintings, music, movies. And the Frankfurt School, I still think now, looking back, I still think they have some of these hangups, even as they were pushing against them. But I was part of this tradition of thinking that culture and aesthetics mattered, and mattered politically, and that they weren't just fluff that you put on top of the rest of the world, that they actually like deeply shape everything that we do, right? And everything we think, and everything that's that we imagine and that's imaginable. So I already was working in this tradition and thinking about film aesthetics and also, other kinds of visual aesthetics. And then I listened to a podcast out of the UK from Alpha to Omega, where Randy Ray appeared. And I could not believe what I was hearing, because everything that I had been trained, and not from a kind of, neoclassical point of view, but from a critical point of view, everything that I was told we couldn't do with money, suddenly I was being told, well, wait, why can't we? Right? Why can't we actually have, a democratic, full employment, a green economy now, right? If we have the political mobilization and will to enact it. And to me, this was just the best news ever. And I remember, like wanting to explore and share the news with some of my colleagues. And they immediately, and this is before Doug Henwood or any of that, they immediately were like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. So that's my origin story. And for me, MMT fundamentally opened up the whole question of the meaning of aesthetics and culture in a totally different way. And I'll just quickly outline how that worked for me, both the kind of mainstream liberal tradition, also the Marxist tradition, had long seen culture and aesthetics as being somehow intrinsically opposed to or in tension with or violently against money and everything to do with money. Culture and aesthetics was kind of, in the more mainstream imagination, a refuge from the world of money and the private market. For certain socialist traditions and Marxist traditions, the aesthetics and culture with its kind of rich, sensuous possibilities became the kind of model of utopia. Like, let's get beyond money and just kind of make our whole lives an aesthetic project. So once you kind of scramble that opposition and say, wait a minute, not only can you have that kind of sensuously realized democratic society by embracing money, but you actually kind of have to embrace money in order to do so. It just it wasn't just a matter of like, oh yeah, let's do this and let's get on this as a political project. It actually just totally opened up research questions in a new way that I'm still asking these questions, and Max is asking these questions as well. So that's my origin story.
That's great. And so the turning point there was, you hearing a podcast and, which is superstructure, like in the, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And which kind of ties us nicely into Max's latest podcast as well. But Max, can you tell us first how you came to MMT?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just listening to Scott there for a moment, I sort of realized that neither him or I have really reflected upon, I think, publicly how we sort of got connected and sort of in this joint project. But when I was younger, before undergrad, I actually would sort of spend a lot of time reading finance Twitter. That was sort of one of the things that I did with my spare time. And that really was the impulse for me to begin the study of economics. I wasn't a Marxist. I wasn't really even a leftist at this point. But I sort of expected going into studying economics to be actually studying economics, right? Not the sort of neoclassical modeling game that what comes out of orthodox economics departments around the country. And doing that, I became increasingly disillusioned with economics and the contradiction between having access to Twitter and finance Twitter and all of these sophisticated thinkers who were really in real time sort of charting the cutting edge of what economic and political analysis could be. And, a lot of these sorts of people became known for publicizing MMT later on. But before then, it was sort of mostly just Keynesian and post-Keynesian thinking. But one of these, being fed up, I sort of branched out at university and started taking courses in the humanities and in art and history, and sort of with the idea to really sort of expand my horizon of thinking, because I needed to know more about the context for what the world become and why economics really wasn't studying the world, essentially. And one of my professors happened to know Scott and introduced me to Scott in the hallway of the Humanities and Cultural Studies department at the University of South Florida. And essentially from there, the sort of rest is history, I suppose. And after a crash course in MMT and aesthetics and culture, I've sort of taken up his project, which I think we both now call our project, in the sense of really pushing, again, back to this question, I think, of superstructure, which is also, as you've mentioned, the name of my podcast with Will Beeman, who is another one of our colleagues at the Modern Money Network, and now also a graduate student of Scott's at the University of South Florida, is to really push on people's comfort levels when it comes to what sort of social forms are actually actively producing our reality, and to even push further, I think, in the sense than the Frankfurt School, which is ultimately what Scott is also doing here, to show how constitutive and intertwined all of these social forms, podcasts themselves, right, from language to culture to money to law, are in how we continue to transform our sort of ongoing political economic world. And I think that's probably the best way to get at both my origins coming into this and then how Scott and I sort of coincide and then are pushing in our respective lanes a little differently.
Yeah. So, and when you said you had a crash course in MMT, can you remember the material that you were fed? Was it fed? I don't know.
Fed. So yeah, I think one of the first things Scott sent me was a talk. I think it was a talk by Randy at UMKC. And that was one of the first things that it started to click with me. But also, I think another way, and Scott and I have reflected on this a little bit, because I had been studying neoclassical economics in all of its sort of normative and assumed forms. Ironically, there was something quite intuitive to me about MMT. It sort of filled a negative space that neoclassical economics had shown was there. Like I sort of knew that there was something wrong here and that there was some missing information. Needed to connect up my experience of finance Twitter and the cutting edge analysis I was reading with the contradiction of what is studied in neoclassical economics departments. And MMT sort of very quickly slotted into that space. And I sort of just began devouring not just texts and videos, but also sort of some of the underlying assumptions that Scott would spell out for me in conversations.
And you mentioned that you weren't initially a lefty, but you were interested in finance. Was that interest to do with politics, or was it, just a general interest in finance and maybe trading, or what transformation did you go through?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was a bit of both. I was definitely interested in finance as a macro phenomenon. I was less interested in, equities or things like that in some more narrow sense. I was interested, I think, in the way that levers of power were articulating themselves through financial mechanisms and how pertinent that was to politics. But I think the reason why I say I wasn't really a leftist in the traditional mold is to say that I, of course, had leftist impulses, but I wasn't. I had never read Capital at that point, right? I wasn't a Marxist, and that this is where I think Scott and I have very different backgrounds, and it sort of informs the way I think as we are coming together with this project, we approach things with similar assumptions, but maybe different sort of instinctual responses to things, in the sense that I wasn't trained in the commodity theory of money as a leftist, in the sense that I didn't read Marx and I didn't read the first 3 chapters of Capital and buy it as the dogma. I came at it from a sort of more Keynesian perspective. And then when I encountered Marx, it was always already having learned MMT. And so that's a very different experience of Marx, because I never had the sort of wow moment of like, this is amazing, that I think a lot of lefties have when they read Marx, because I had already been disabused of that sort of bewildering amazement.
I'm going to ask Max a question. So
taking over.
It's like a self-cleaning oven.
How much would you say your interest in finance had something to do with your and your family's experience in the great financial crisis?
Yes. I think actually with hindsight, that's definitely the case. My family, we lost our house in the financial crisis, and there were plenty of people who were far better off than we were. But yeah, there's definitely lingering, I think, interests for me in that time about understanding the relationships between these sort of macro decision-making processes and the particular events of the financial crisis, and of course my experience of them. And I think that's something that I carry forward in the Superstructure Project, and I know Will Beeman does as well, in the sense of really mapping how these big macro forces affect and are constitutive of the very particular immediate experiences we all have.
So with superstructure, you guys are talking about MMT in a very different way. Tell us about that. I'm halfway through the Scaling the Cascade.
Okay.
Scaling the Cascade episode, because I was like, right, yeah, I'm going in. There's a lot to get your head around if you're me.
Right.
Oh, there's a lot to get your head around if you're anyone.
Right. Okay. We'll talk a bit more about it later, but why don't you tell us a bit about where you're coming from?
Yeah. Okay. So it's so funny. I'm not sure I expected to be answering questions about this on this episode, but I'm flattered. I think the best way to talk about superstructure is Will and I are really trying to start at the beginning, assuming the high level sort of MMT literature at the outset, right? And so I think what listeners will notice is that we throw them into the deep end immediately. And so that's maybe the first thing I'd say. The second is, I think the Superstructure podcast is also situating itself within a left media ecosystem in a very particular way, in the sense that we recognize the power that the superstructure has in the sense of forming narratives and defining spaces of discourse. And a great example of this is the podcast Chapo Trap House, which I think it wouldn't be exaggerating to say really helped define the left media space for the Bernie moment in the US. And as well, in certain ways too, also speaking of the UK context, dabbled in the way the relationship between the US left and the UK left was mediated on Twitter. And I think it's one thing to say, okay, that's important, but ultimately there are these more fundamental base relationships going on. And I think what we want to do in bringing together the assumption of MMT with this intervention in a left media ecosystem is to really force people to confront that language and ideas are and theory itself, right? And I think there's going to be a third prong to this answer as well that I'll introduce. But it is one of the prime causes and factors in defining our imagination when it comes to what is possible and what isn't, and opening up certain political futures and foreclosing certain political futures. That's the starting point of the podcast. And from there, we really want to actually perform our arguments as well aesthetically, and really push listeners to leave no stone unturned as far as theoretical origins. And it's interesting that you all and Scott did an episode on Marx and MMT, because in many ways, Scott was trying to synthesize Marx and MMT. And that is also crucially important for getting at and sort of having an inclusive left. And I wholeheartedly support that project and that vision, though diversity of tactics as well, coming from a left perspective that isn't Marxist. Both Will and I are really trying to actually push and go beyond that synthesis in a way, and really push people in the vacuum after the Corbyn and Bernie loss to really rethink first theoretical premises. And so filling that space in left ecosystem, assuming MMT, and then embarking on this journey, which I think the Scaling of the Cascade episode tries to get at, this sort of never-ending performance of a journey to uncovering new theoretical premises for a left that is not reductive to class, that is intersectional, that is radical in all different types of ways, would be perhaps the best summation of, I think, what we're trying to do with that podcast.
I'm interested in this idea of how the American and the UK left intertwine, because even though there is a lot of interaction on Twitter, I see news from either side, an opinion from either side, and often I can't discern between them. There still feels like there is, and maybe this is relevant, to the superstructure theme, but there is still a cultural divide between the two political views. And it often feels that there shouldn't be as much. But so what's your view on that? Are we completely disconnected from the US political perspective?
So I guess I have to put my cards on the table here. So I am a dual citizen. I'm a UK and American citizen. So I don't think we can plead to completely disconnected, because I would not exist in that way, right? So, but I do think what you're getting at here is definitely true. There are absolutely differences in sort of the historical horizon of social democracy versus what the US left in its more radical intersectional guises has been over time. And those are in no way want to homogenize those differences and saying that there are similarities. However, I do think there is a sort of dance that's going on between the UK and the US at the moment. And I think with Brexit and Trump and then Bernie and Corbyn, there's some really interesting narrative coincidences with regards to some of the limits of the contemporary left imagination. And I think I've talked about the fiscal accountability rule often in the context of MMT and obviously this preoccupation with balanced budgets, as well as the sort of tax to spend logics that both Bernie and Corbyn dabble in and have dabbled in, to put it kindly, considering some of the Cayman Islands discourse, for example, in the lead up to the December general election and John McDonnell's, entire political project, really. So I think those through lines are definitely there. Going forward, there's a really, I think, interesting open contestation that needs to happen. And in many ways, perhaps the American and UK contexts are moving away from each other again. I think we'll have to see on how that goes, because there is still a sort of institutional left in the UK that the US lacks in a way, as far as power is
just
concerned.
Building it, right?
Right, or is just building.
The squad was just reelected.
Exactly.
Yes, we're at a moment of formation, right? Not legacy and like in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me, I don't know about you, Patricia, but the legacy has been trashed. We got the most left-wing Labour government of my lifetime.
Yeah.
And the attacks came from within, the calls are coming from inside the house, and so that says to me the limits of the Labour Party. But, I'll probably cut this out.
I think we had a very similar, we started from very similar positions in the sense that we both had two main parties, which for a while were playing against each other and exchanging power between each other. But both parties ended up being captured by really right wingers, and under the pretense that one of them was lefty and the other one wasn't. So we started from that. And then obviously, so maybe it's not so surprising that Bernie and Corbyn came together at the time that they did. I remember at the time when the whole thing was very young and everybody was full of hope. and we were, I was part of this group called Momentum, which is still going, but is not as strong as it used to. And remember Bernie Sanders' kind of campaign managers or people who were leaders within the campaign of Bernie Sanders actually were invited to Momentum meetings to help us, teach us how to campaign effectively, use methods that they had used in America that were successful. So, I think that shows that we were learning from each other and we were taking each other's lessons very seriously.
Right.
But at the same time, often that meant that we were making the same mistakes. And or sometimes some tactics that were good for America were not so good for here, and vice versa. But it's always a learning process. But it does feel like ultimately we have both, at least those projects failed. Maybe, has to do with errors that we have made, but also because the external factors were similar to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make also one point on this, because I think this ties back to Scott and I's shared project here. I think one of the reasons why we want to go back to first premises, theoretically speaking, is because, certainly speaking for myself here, I don't think it's enough to just say that we tried our best and that we had the correct analysis, but we were hampered by the external factors, i.e. the superstructure or the media or these sorts of things. It's not to say that those were not factors, right? But I do think that there's a fundamental flaw in both the Corbyn and Bernie vision of politics. And that is something that we really want to push on with regards to MMT, and really foregrounding not just the we can pay for it, but also all of the sort of cascading consequences of what that means. And so to not let that be enough at the outset is really important, I think, for the way we're approaching politics.
Yeah, so I would say that what Money on the Left is doing, but I think superstructure takes to a whole new level, is it really fundamentally rejects zero-sum logics at every single level. Mm-hmm. And then, I think superstructure is actually aiming at several goals at once. But I think one of them is to really tease out the perverse consequences and assumptions and values that come out on the left as a result of deeply held zero-sum, what we could call metaphysics, or, just like the way the left thinks the world actually works, right? And of course, I think it crystallizes most in the explicit language of fiscal politics that MMT is very good at explaining. But what the kind of first generation of MMTers did is sort of offered us a totally different analysis that broke with that zero-sum thinking at the level of economics, at the level of fiscal politics, but didn't carry that same underlying impulse to other areas. And I think that's what that's what superstructure is doing right now. And, superstructure can be a little aggressive, and it can be funny as hell and scary, because Max and Will are like really teasing out the like kind of sick and disgusting and violent and also self-harming assumptions that rise to the surface when we are on the left deeply committed to, a sound money view of the whole fucking universe.
So let's get into some MMT now. And we're going to talk about your paper that you co-authored with William Sass and Benjamin
Wilson.
That's it. And it's called the Uni Currency Project: Democratic Finance for Public Higher Education After COVID-19. So before we get into what the uni is, I just thought it might be useful to say what an anchor institution is, because I was hoping this could maybe help people over here in the UK and maybe other parts of the world in other disciplines see the potential to use and build on what you're doing with the uni. So could you say something about that?
Yeah. So, the tradition in economics is to speak in terms of two poles of studying economics. There's microeconomics and there's macroeconomics. And macroeconomics, if you're an MMTer, you understand that macroeconomics is about the federal government and the central bank and these large systems and the way they organize the world. And then microeconomics is about the local, the individual, and that kind of thing. But then there's at least another term that we could introduce, which would be the meso level, mesoeconomics, in between, right? That's not quite federal, but is also not just really small micro local actors. And honestly, our economies are in large part driven in a big way by these meso-level major institutions and actors. I mean, Amazon would be one of them, right? Walmart would be another one of them. But also, we don't often think of it this way, but also public university systems, and of course also private ones as well. But so we talk about medium to large public universities and university systems, at least in the US, as anchor institutions because they are the central driver and hub of economic activity within regions. So all the small businesses that are in the college town and beyond all rely on students and faculty inhabiting that area, inhabiting that little city that is the university, and going out and spending money around it. The whole community relies on the big, often problematic, but nevertheless, the big investments that these anchor institutions make, right? Big medical centers, all kinds of research grants. Basically, the way we think of the university as an anchor institution is that it is a fundamental meso-level groundwork for all the economic activity that happens in and around a university. And, so we're concerned with all the kind of talk of austerity across levels, right, across the world right now. We're concerned about all of them, but we've taken up specifically the problem of responding to the COVID depression with more austerity, with this counter proposal that says this is the worst thing that you could do right now, right? We need investment right now, and we need investment from precisely these anchor institutions, because the more these anchor institutions contract and hold back, the more it's going to cause economic, depression and chaos all around them.
So with that, let's talk about what the uni is. And maybe we could just talk about munis first as well. Who wants to start?
One thing I'd also say with regards to anchor institutions is I think in the UK context, obviously universities being one, but I think also thinking about councils in that way is crucially important too. And I think, we can maybe flag that to also continue the discussion onward when we start talking about munis and unis.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring up councils, but my first question when I first heard about unis in the plan for unis was, can councils do this in the UK? And I know, this is effectively a parallel currency, and I know that there are some laws with regards to the use of currencies in councils where they are only allowed to use the pound sterling or else, and I don't know to what extent, we could go around those rules.
If anybody is listening who knows this podcast, who knows this movement, who knows who Rowan Gray is, and also knows who the British equivalent of Rowan Gray is, please tell that person to get in touch, because that's what that's where we need to be looking at, I guess, to answer that question.
I think it would be helpful to spell out in the plainest way possible what we're proposing in the American context, and then move the discussion to the UK context. And I guess what I do want to say about what we're proposing is it's a kind of open, constructive project that has definite plans, but there's several contingencies that we've built into this project. So I've been thinking of it. I've been using the term a problem space. It's a kind of problem to work on, not just a narrow set of rigid descriptions, right? And so if you're going to start a uni at a large university system like the University of California system, what you can do is different than if you do it through a kind of smaller public university system. So maybe we can get into some of the basic pieces of the project. I don't know, Max, do you want to?
Yeah. So just thinking about like what the Muni is, which initially with the name Uni, we were sort of rhyming with what munis are and what the Muni market is in the US. And essentially munis, right, which sort of stands for municipalities, and in the sense the municipal bond market, is essentially has been a way for states and localities to issue debt and fund investment in their communities. And that is essentially what these bonds are. However, there are a lot of wrinkles in the different ways in which the munis are acting and can be acting, right? The state of California or the city of Tampa could issue these bonds and sell them to private actors and pay 4% interest on them. And that's the secondary muni market, right? That's a sort of more traditional sense of a quote unquote private lending agreement and lending contract. However, given the COVID crisis, the Federal Reserve, who has generally been much more experimental in their response to this crisis than, for example, Congress, who has sat on their hands, they opened a municipal bond facility, a muni facility, for states and localities, and even some other meso-level public institutions to apply for support and lending, essentially having the Federal Reserve buy their bonds and hold them on their balance sheet. And what this is, which there are certainly a lot of issues with regards to interest rates and terms that I think in the sort of problem space that Scott was sketching, we want to bracket a little bit and say that there's certainly a horizon of possibility here that goes beyond the very specific terms of these lending agreements. But essentially what we have here is the active facilitation of local spending by the Federal Reserve, which is, I hesitate to say unprecedented, but is certainly different than how American finance has operated in the past. And it actually opens up the fact that as far as tiers of responsibility for political economy, there's now a direct line between every single meso-level institution and likewise every single small business in those communities and the center of political economy revolving around money creation at the federal level.
Or there's potentially one. Yeah.
Correct. Right. But the line of responsibility is opened in the sense of there's now a route for politically contesting in a different way, rather than just saying, going to Congress, hey, we need to bail out municipalities, which we absolutely should also do. This is potentially an alternative route to getting at some of these political questions of fiscal policy. And so that it is from that sort of opening that we are trying to then really rethink finance in general with regards to these meso-level institutions and really democratize finance. And I'll let Scott talk a bit more about the leap we're making from there.
Yes, I want to talk about the uni, but I do want to say a kind of MMT 2.0 lesson. There's a bit of a tension in the MMT literature and public outreach campaign that on the one hand, we say, well, the federal government, the currency issuer, it basically has unlimited capacity to spend. Its only constraint is the speed limit of inflation, which is about real resource constraints, et cetera. We're all very familiar with this. On the other hand, we're also all post-Keynesians in the sense that we understand that money creation is endogenous, right? And that means not just it's endogenous at the fiscal level, but it's endogenous all the way down through the banks. And we're all familiar with our good friend Bob Hockett's idea of the finance franchise and the way that, essentially banks don't lend out deposits. Instead, they have to have certain capital requirements, and then they create money out of thin air for whatever, credit-worthy recipients there are out there. And they do this on a regular basis, right? Even the Bank of England seems to understand this. The tension is that on the one hand, we say, well, currency users kind of have to just recycle private money, but the federal government has the magic money tree. Once you start actually talking about the way finance is organized through the central bank, then you realize that there isn't such a hard opposition between the currency user and the currency issuer. And in fact, that currency issuance is something that can be structured in different ways and at different local levels and serving more democratic needs. So I think one of the things that we're trying to use this crisis moment to do is to really push the envelope in thinking about, and I think Robert Hockett's also doing it in his own way through his own project that he's calling Community QE. Is trying to think about, how do we create endogenous money producing structures at meso level governmental institutions such that they can serve their immediate communities, right? And that's what Fed or central bank support for creating liquidity locally sort of allows. So then we come to the crisis, the totally unnecessary and absolutely feigned crisis of university finance today in the face of COVID. And we proposed the uni in sort of, let's say, two interrelated ways. One is as a kind of complementary currency. And the reason why a uni could be a public university issued complementary credit, complementary currency, is because of the meso level anchor status of these institutions. They own lots and lots of property. They receive what our colleague likes to call non-reciprocal obligations, essentially a kind of tax, all the time in the form of tuition and fines and fees and rents and all kinds of things like that. Basically, they have a fiscal tax circuit already operating. So you can introduce a complementary currency into that and actually just tap into the powers that are already there. Now, the question becomes, what is the power of this complementary currency? What is its relationship to the dollar? And what is its relationship to the dollar at a time of increasing crisis and depression? So the second prong of our uni proposal is to say, while on one hand, we would be happy to have universities pursue complementary currencies and, build up their fiscal tax provisioning circuit in a careful way, right? But we don't have time for that right now, right? This is a total crisis, right? And we're putting young people back in dorms, for the fall in just, a week's time right now, only because the universities think they need their dollars in order to, persist as an institution, right? Making these absolutely bonkers, genocidal decisions, right? So we don't have time for this. So that's why we are proposing simultaneously that these complementary currencies would essentially be immediately backstopped by the Fed. And that could look different. And depending on how the political fight and the political discourse takes shape and what organization takes it up and tries to pursue it. So you could imagine the Fed is just a buyer of last resort that says, look, nobody has to be worried about the uni because we'll always buy it. Or you could open up central bank swap lines, which essentially buys the uni as soon as they're issued, which essentially converts them to dollars. And then the uni is just more like the name of the political project. And what you're really spending is dollars, right? That would probably be the most powerful way forward. But then there's other opportunities here as well. Getting local governments, cities and counties to join in on the uni project and receive unis in taxes and even receive property taxes from these universities that are typically exempt from them. So they actually get a windfall of uni revenue by virtue of accepting them, right? And if you do that and you do that with a big enough university system, then the fiscal tax circuit is robust enough at the meso level that you don't really have to worry about the Fed. And at that point, the Fed will just be like, why wouldn't we support this? It's already a thing. It's already happening. Like we're here. We're supposed to be supporting these critical infrastructures. So that would be my initial pitch. And what you're seeing here, or hopefully you're understanding, is that there's just a lot of different ways to pursue this. What matters is that what we want to do is make universities essentially self-financing meso-level institutions that can really anchor their economies, their local economies in hopefully democratic ways as needed, right? So a lot of the language that we use in the MMT community about the federal level that they can spend as needed. They just have to worry about, well, are there enough laborers? Are there enough resources? Should we, yes, we can afford to bring all the students back on campus, but should we, right? Like all these questions are still there, but we're kind of bringing that, what some of my colleagues at MMN like to say, the infinity sign of money to university politics and economics.
So there's a lot to unpack in there.
There is.
But my question was, when we speak about these meso kind of institutions, the power that they have within the big kind of picture is all granted by, property laws. It's the legal structure posed by effectively the currency issuer, right? So is it right to see them as overlapping domains of power? The university will have a subdomain within the larger domain of the country, etc. So my question is, there have been cases where universities have issued kind of these parallel currencies, things like buckaroos, that were more about an experiment within campus with limited reach, right? Beyond campus, it wasn't really worth much. So what you guys are proposing is this system in order to undo damage which has been done at federal level through austerity or through lack of funding. If that lack of funding or those austerity policies had political intent, to what extent will these initiatives be opposed on the basis that they undermine the overall government strategy with regards to education, even when we know that is currently very damaging?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of good stuff there. So one thing I'll say is, yes, of course, this is a political fight. This is not a technocratic fix, right? And I think part of the gamble here is no one is going to be prepared for this political fight. They won't know what hit them. That doesn't mean we'll win, right? But it means that for the powers that be to get wind of this and devise a counter strategy, they will already be in the reactive position because we will have broken through enough and along channels that they're just not used to thinking about. And this is back to, I think, what Max was saying earlier. I mean, we might start actually tipping over into the UK comparison because it's different in the UK. In the United States of America, other than the CARES Act, which everybody says was so much money, it really wasn't, and it wasn't enough, right? And then they've done nothing since. You really have nothing happening in Congress. And because of that, right, there is this pretty radical opening at the central bank in relationship to the entire economy, and not just in the United States, but beyond. They're giving swap lines and they're giving liquidity support across the globe, right? And that is a historic opportunity. And in many ways, we've been trying to kind of, on Money on the Left, really frame what's been happening before COVID as a serious and increasing paradigm crisis in central banking and finance. And I think for those people who are inside, they might not want to use that language, but I think they would see why we were using that language. And I think what happened, they warned, our interest rates are so low, we're not going to be able to do much with the next crisis. And they've been saying it again and again and again. And, we in the MMT community snicker and say like, haha, they don't do shit anyway, right? Unless you're Paul Volcker and you want to really screw things up, right? And what this COVID emergency and the Fed action has done is just blown the lid off the whole thing. I just think like the paradigm is done, right? And it's all up for grabs right now. And, both intellectually, like it was, in the monetarist coup in the 60s and 70s, it's a really exciting time. And it stands to be a super big political fight. And it's a way of democratizing money that isn't just about congressional appropriation. Congressional appropriation is good, and we should do that. But we could also imagine more locally sensitive ways of issuing money. And of course, we could always imagine that. But I think politically right now, this is a good time for that. I don't know if Max wants to add something.
Yeah, I think what I'd add then is in contrast, which is I think what you're getting at, Patricia, is that the UK context is I think it's messier, specifically in the sense of we've seen active, not just technical coordination, which of course is always the case between the Bank of England and Parliament, but political coordination to the point where the salary matching scheme and all of the other COVID measures feels much more solid, and there's much less wiggle room for experimentation. And in a way, I think this is a lesson in the fact that the US sort of powers that be have really dropped the ball on their own interests in the long term. And I think the Tories have sort of realized that in order to sort of quote unquote save the sort of hegemony of capitalists over the system, that there needed to be a very swift protection of capital. Whereas in the US, that protection came in sort of fits and starts and sort of a hodgepodge of different formulations, whether it's through the Fed or the Fed might be buying equity soon. There's all sorts of different ways in which this is going on, rather than a sort of single coherent coordinated strategy. And so like in the UK, there's very specific terms on what universities have to do to get bailed out by Parliament. Whereas in the US, that's not even a conversation. Like that's not even a possibility, right? And so there's perhaps more possibility within the wreckage of the just absolutely catastrophic US response to the crisis. Whereas I think it's more of an uphill, immediate political fight in the UK, though I do wonder if, because there perhaps is a more recent and longer history of the left fighting on the terms of things like devaluation and these sorts of questions, if that perhaps there's a way to revive that in the future when we actually focus the fight in on what the actual fight is, which is, I think, what the point I was trying to make earlier, in the sense of Corbyn and Bernie, for better or for worse, weren't fighting the actual fight over the infinity sign of money. And so that's sort of what I think the uni framework allows for politically, is active organization over these questions and activism specifically over the questions of councils having the right to issue credit, for example. There's lots of ways, I think, to formulate this, but I think that's how I see the perhaps the division happening.
Perhaps what I had in mind was, I know, for example, here there is a policy to underfund councils, and it's been going on for 10 years. And the rumor has it, I've got it from good source, that the overall plan is to completely remove central funding from councils and make them entirely reliant on local taxation. So if I know now, and people knew years ago, that was the ultimate aim, then seeing councils suddenly find a way to mobilize resources at local level will not be seen kindly. And, I don't know how the government would frame it, but they might frame it as a form of insurgency or fraud or something, and crack down on it as fast as possible using law. And I was perhaps wondering to what extent that would happen in the US. I guess, the federal structure of government maybe leaves more room for decentralized approach to government in the US. Maybe on that side, you have an advantage over us.
Yeah, I think these are definitely the questions, right? I guess another way of saying it, it's like without coming down one way or another specifically on the legal questions here, I think these are the fights we want to have, and they're going to be the fights ultimately that we're going to have in court. Whether there's room or not, I think perhaps is another way of thinking about this. But the fact of getting to that place means that as far as a pedagogical tool of MMT and of democratizing finance, we will have already won a lot of the battle on educating people where the fights are. And that, I think, is crucial. And so that's another part of this problem space, I think a lot of people definitely recognize that balanced budgets are an ideological bludgeon, right? That the right uses and that the center and center left defers to. This is the next step in the fight against balanced budgets and against sound money. And it's to teach people that essentially credit creation can happen endogenously anywhere along the cascade of meso-level institutions.
Mm-hmm. Great, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. I love it in the paper you called the Fed the historical choreographer of credit, which I think that's the first time I've heard that. So, as people that think deeply about rhetoric, and we touched on it earlier, we know that MMTers sooner or later, like you say, it's a 2.0 thing for MMTers, understanding endogenous money. And we've got an episode with Sam Levy about that where we unpack it a bit more. But I'd really love to hear from each of you about how you would arm MMTers or give them the tools they need to understand endogenous money. How should it be talked about? Because, the first thing that happens when the light bulb goes on, the government can't run out of money. It all comes from the government. And then a bit later on, it's a seeming wrinkle where in it where they go, but actually banks create money, and Warren Moses kind of will just go, they're acting as agents of government when they do that. You can't just anybody can't just do that, and so that kind of ties a bow in it for your sort of MMT who's still coming to grips with it. But how do you guys talk about it?
There's so many different ways. I mean, I'll start with a more straightforward way. And I've been, I think, sharpening this a little bit more in talking to local candidates and politicians and the like around Florida and beyond, especially during the crisis. The MMT, that's pretty good. MMT.
Freudian slip.
Yeah. The MMT idiom, right? That spending has to come before taxation. Right, because if none of you had pounds, if they were not spent into the economy first, right, you could not have them taxed back, right? There would be no pounds. This goes back to, I think, what we were talking about before in terms of the kind of humanities 2.0 and legal 2.0 MMT project is we're trying to get at the deeper assumptions and the deeper logics, right? So another way of saying that is that credit comes first. And any kind of revenue, any kind of return in the form of profit or in the form of taxation always comes second, logically speaking, right? So in a crisis, when people aren't spending and people are being thrown out of work, what is going to allow any given entity, a government, a sub-federal government, a school system, a small business, what is going to enable them to pay their bills and continue? Credit, right? Because that always comes first. Donald Trump hasn't actually made a lot of money. He just has a brand. He inherited a lot of money, and then he has a brand that enables him to get a lot of credit, right? Because that's where it starts. So once you realize that federal spending comes first, taxation comes second, all spending, all credit creation out of thin air, which means embedded in a governmental and legal system, all credit has to come first and all revenue, all returns come second. It totally shifts everything at once, right? So it's not just about what Parliament does or what the Bank of England does or what, Barclays does or whatever.
Right? I kind of want to pick up from that and perhaps in a fashion that's more in the superstructure brand, sort of offer a metaphor here, which is if we think about credit as a language that perhaps banks can speak because they are licensed to, you can start to sort of think with and understand how knowing the language of credit, right? Like, for example, knowing the English language allows all of us to speak. And we can say the words that signify the different meanings. And endogenous money we can think about it in the way of you are licensed to speak credit into the world. And that is ultimately a question of what sort of institutions we want to allow to speak and to create meaning in our political environments and to create activity and production in our political environments. And when it's framed that way, I think it's very clear that the political resonances of who we allow agency in this process, whether it's universities or it's councils, or if we want to just defer to Wall Street banks, this is the central political question. And so speaking the language of money is something that we need to make sure is maximally affording democratic relationships throughout all of society and relative autonomy to actors who are more intimately aware with the particular circumstances of their local community.
It is absolutely absurd that local governments cannot issue direct public credit, but private banks can. I mean, that is atrocious, right? And I think saying that, I think, opens up a whole horizon for thinking differently.
Yeah. No, that is a great way to put it. Yeah, absolutely.
Each council or each local authority should have its own bank, effectively.
Sure.
Yeah. And many universities already have bank charters, right? And so that's one of the points on the uni that I think we're trying to flex too. But this is essentially its own bank. And then I think to take it further, banking not as a lending institution, but as a grant institution.
Right.
These are not loans that need to be paid back, right? Spending is a grant that instantiates economic activity and supports it. And so obviously then, of course, what's the MMT lesson? It's that inflation is the speed limit, quote unquote. And there are multiple mechanisms aside from taxation, but also including taxation, that then come into play after that.
Okay, something's just rattling around in my head in that, let's talk about the euro. The reason that there are these Maastricht limits on how much each Eurozone member state can spend is to avoid moral hazard. You know, the state that, right, am I right?
Yeah. It's just the most evil, ridiculous expression that I would reject. Yeah. Moral hazard. Yeah. Reject humane life. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
No. What they refer to, what some would refer to as moral hazard. Oh my God, I'm glad you're over there. And so what the idea is, the state that deficit spends the most wins in that if there are no limits. Obviously, the limits need to be, if they want to keep the euro together, it's going to have to be revised upwards, and they've got to see the humanity of the people that they're screwing over. So I'm just thinking about these municipalities having no limit, to the credit they can create. And this is a new experience for me because I'm just like, hey, let's spend, but I'm now thinking, what's the dampener on that? Because obviously we in MMT, before we were talking about this, we would say, well, look, if you're worried about inflation, that's great. We are too. We actually have the only explanation of the source of the price level. Actually, if you're interested, our fix for stabilizing the price level is also the thing that ensures full true employment. I just think, how do we talk about complementary currencies and address these concerns at the same time, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think I would say that ideally, in the case of the Eurozone, they wouldn't necessarily be complementary currencies. They would all still be the euro, and you would just have greater issuing authority. I think that part of the underlying logic of your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this assumption that anti-MMT people have and just kind of everyone else has is that as soon as you lift the cap, you're inviting a kind of irrational exuberance and everybody just spending as much. Yeah. So first of all, no, we're not recommending irrational exuberance, right? That's one. The other thing is that we have people and institutions whose jobs it is right now to coordinate across micro, macro, and meso levels, right? Dealing with all the kinds of pressures, right? But it's doing so in a way that naturalizes austerity and serves a certain capitalist class. So, we could imagine just having those, inventing new kinds of institutions and positions that are measuring kind of regional inflationary effects, and also doing things to kind of clamp down on private speculation, right, in local economies. So there's all kinds of things that you can do, right? And you have to be serious. If you're going to give a massive public university system spending authority that they can at their discretion set their own budget, they have to think about what's the population right now? How many people are unemployed? I mean, and we have to have experts who study this kind of thing and measure this kind of thing in order to do it right.
I think I'd also add, I think there's a way here to redeem the sort of MMT line about full employment and price stability, in the sense that we start from the premise that we already have a world in which money is created in centralized and relatively decentralized forms, right? Money is already being created, and all analyses of not only the deficit or whatever that ends up being as an accounting matter, but also the price level is always happening after the fact anyway. So I think when you start from that perspective and then add in the first principle of democratizing finance as a good in itself, a necessity in itself for having a humane society, you can begin to see how the price level, whatever, and whatever that is, right? But the regional pricing structures that are constantly changing have to be baked in to the productive capacity of new spending. And I mean that in the sense of, we are terrible at price stability right now. We don't have regional commissions of price stability in the very particular sense of looking at the very micro data to actually analyze in an MMT fashion the relationship between money and pricing and full employment. And of course, there are surveys, but I mean in a very active political sense. And so I think what Scott is suggesting is a regulatory apparatus with this very particular question in mind. And reminded today, as we were recording, that AMC Theaters in the United States, which is the biggest theater chain, is reopening, which on its own terms is completely bonkers and stupid to pack people into movie theaters in the United States. But the ticket cost for AMC Theaters is 15 cents, as opposed to what was usually between $10 and $15 before the crisis. This is a very particular example with very particular narratives and variables. But this is an instance of we've seen a rapid drop in the price of movie theaters, right? And this is something that's a political question, right? Maybe it shouldn't be 15 cents, right? Maybe it should be a lot more right now. I don't know. This is something we have to argue about. But once you open up the view of all the taps that are already pouring into the basin of money creation, if we want to keep with the somewhat problematic metaphor, you start to be able to look around and say, okay, these are a bunch of things that we now need to take responsibility for as a political matter on the back end, and also build in structures that can precede any irrational exuberance if that should come to pass.
Right. And if we had it our way, we would have union representatives, Black Lives Matter representatives, and, you name it as part of this infrastructure. I think Stephanie Kelton talks about revolutionizing the Congressional Budget Office, right? So instead of it doing the awful work of pay-fors and offsets that it does now, it would use all the kind of number crunching analysis power that it has to think about inflation, right? And you can imagine that happening in a very democratic way, up and down kind of scales of economic activity.
Another issue I could envisage happening, maybe I'm thinking more of Latin America at this point than here, but I imagine people here would also bring up the fact that if councils had more freedom of to issuing grants and, of this spending, corruption comes in, and something, I guess, maybe they would demand some measures in terms of either some ground rules as to on the basis of which this money is issued, or maybe things like increased transparency. And, I think people would see that as an issue here. I think that it would definitely be an issue in Latin America, for example, where the culture has a lot of corruption ingrained in it, in the political sphere. So is there something attached to this alongside the way that it operates for, increased transparency and therefore democracy?
I think to start with saying, taking a wider historical perspective on this, I think the reason why corruption rings potentially that way in different places around the world is because of the active production of imperial debt relations in a very particular way, as well as colonial relations of politics. But I think to bracket that aside for one moment.
And domestic austerity.
Which goes hand in hand. Yeah. To bracket that for a moment, I think this is where participatory budgeting comes in the sense of you actually build democratic agency into the grant allocation process. And of course, increased transparency, all for it as well. But I think truly radically democratizing finance doesn't mean we give a university, okay, you can spend whatever you want, but then we let the chancellor decide what things get spent on. And it might just all go to the football team at that point. And so then it really becomes bringing the stakeholders together and having the messy democratic fights over what we want to fund. And not everyone's going to be happy. That right, in the sense of some people's projects might lose in that. But there is a system and a series of stages to funding so that it's not ever one person who's just deciding to press a button and grant their friend the contract for X and Y project.
To put a little button on it, it's the difference between fighting over austerity and fighting over abundance, right? Mm-hmm. And, is there going to be corruption in abundance? I don't know, maybe, probably. I don't care. There's already insane corruption in austerity. Let's have abundance and then see how that works out.
Well, I'd much rather be fighting over that, obviously. I'd much rather we have that argument as opposed to the current argument of fighting over scraps, basically. Yeah. In Peru, for example, the corrupt political structures and the whole of South America really, as you're saying, they are intrinsically linked to austerity and unfairness in the system and pre-colonial power structures, etc. So, but at the same time, they don't go away overnight because it's something that, it's happened for so many decades that it's almost become a lifestyle for so many, and it's become normalized. And though I completely believe that, a country can overcome these obstacles, at the same time, some transitionary maybe measures need to be put in place to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another way of saying this is we should absolutely put bankers in jail. But also we can create credit at all levels of the meso structure.
Yeah. And I think this question and this problem plays out differently in different contexts, but one of them I'm reminded of is some of the whispering that even happens within the MMT community about this kind of idea that, we shouldn't tell the Republicans about MMT because then they'll use it for bad things, right? Which is like, okay, they already use it for bad things.
Sorry, one more thing I'll note before on the corruption part, right? It can go the other way too, where corruption becomes like the deficit, the tool for the right to purge left-wingers from government, whether it's in Bolivia or in Brazil. This is sort of the other side of that coin too. So I think ultimately rejecting the framing that corruption is stealing a finite portion of the economy for one individual is the way forward.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, this has been a great chat, and look forward to doing it again one day. So just before we wrap up, what we'll do in the show notes, we'll link to all things Scott and Max and Money on the Left and Superstructure. But is there any one place or several places that people could visit if they want to get involved in the Uni initiative? Is there any way for people to get involved?
I'd say, honestly, probably the easiest way is to DM us on Twitter.
Just study law.
Study law as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll get on the phone with anyone. Yeah.
Open invitation. Yeah.
Brilliant. So that's any worker-led body or movement, anybody that wants to get involved, that would be great. Yeah. Okay. So it's been an absolute treat to talk to you guys. And, thanks for your time and being so generous with your time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Let's do it again sometime.
Thanks so much for having us.
Bye.
Bye. That was the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Editing and post-production was by Damien Caldwell. Thanks for listening.